Hi, and welcome to Chapter 25, Learning Objective 4. And in this particular learning objective, we're going to take a little look at saving and investment, and its impact on productivity. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. Oh, helped if I started the slideshow. So let me do that real quick here. As you can see, it's a pretty short chapter, but we're going to take a look at, again, the saving and investment and its impact on growth. So before I do that, let me just make sure that I really differentiate saving from investment. So saving is what we think of when we think of saving. Saving is taking money and saving it for a future time period. So things that would count as savings would be things like putting your money into a savings account. Okay, well, that's an easy one, but I'm going to make it a lot more complicated now, because another type of savings would be buying bonds, buying stock. So savings is one of those things that includes what typical people think of as investing. Okay, but we're economists, so we're going to use economic definitions here. So savings would be savings accounts, checking accounts, those kinds of things. It would also be buying bonds, even if there is a rate of return on those. It would be buying stocks. Okay. Investment, however, and let me see if I can change up the color here a little bit for you. Let's see, there's my pen. Kind of hard to see here. Stop it. All right, let's see. Oh. Okay, so investment is where you are investing in a long-term asset, and that asset will have a rate of return. Now, yes, you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Lisa, bonds and stocks are assets. They are, but they're financial assets. I'm talking physical assets, okay? So here, investment, you're looking at a physical asset. If you build a new house, you are actually investing. If you buy equipment for your business, you are actually investing. If you basically, the differentiation we're going to make in this course is investment has, and let me just write it over here, investment has an underlying physical asset. Now, we're going to really get into this in some later objectives, but because we're talking about it right now, I thought I'd differentiate it. But, okay, an investment is not, okay, financial investing, meaning buying stocks and bonds. Okay, so in the course, I will differentiate the two by saying that in investing, there's an underlying physical asset, and more so, it is not financial investment. I will always make sure that I put this word financial if I'm talking about stocks and bonds. Okay, we're going to talk about this in some later chapters, but I just wanted to clearly differentiate it for you here because we're talking about those two things. So how does savings impact economic growth? Well, if you think about it, if you put your money in a savings account, just stop my share for a second. If you put your money into a savings account, then your bank takes all of those savings accounts and turns around and lends it back out to people to expand business, to build new businesses. So every time you see a new construction, you usually will see a sign that says finance provided by. And that means that every entity that is saving with that institution is really fueling that investment, which then helps to increase gross domestic product, which then helps to grow the economy. So it's a very reciprocal relationship, and we'll talk more about that in this course. Oops, didn't want to do that. So let me go ahead and go back to our slides. So now that we really know the difference between them, one of the things that we look at is, do we how does it impact the short-term and long-term productivity? So many students have a trade-off that they have to look at. Let's see if I can do this. Oop. And here's the trade-off that you might be facing. I often face too. Here's our trade-off. Do I work today, or do I engage in increasing human capital? Okay, so how can I boil that down into more understandable language? Okay, you might have the opportunity today to work, go to work for maybe 8 hours, or you could, God forbid, study economics for 8 hours. Okay, you're making that trade-off. Now, if you, well, we all need money, but if you, right now, in your case, work is more important, you might forego school, right, to work today, which increases your gains today. So I'll put the short term because you're increasing your gains today, right? People engage in decisions because of the payoff, right? However, if you forego school for very long periods of time, or maybe never engage in additional schooling, then the short-term gain you're getting today is coming at the long-term gain of productivity, and having maybe a higher wage, okay? Because you would go to school, get a degree, and have a higher wage. So this is one of the things that happens, particularly on the macro level. So do we increase jobs, ready to work jobs, okay? Or do we increase educational funding? Now, we're not going to see a payoff in productivity and educational funding in the short term. It'll be much more long-term and focused. So that's difficult sometimes to balance those. So this is what we say is, hey, when we look at this, we're going to devote fewer resources to produce more goods and services for current consumption. But then what will happen is we will have a greater productivity in the longer term. So in thinking about this, I often have a struggle in our business department. For example, it's not a struggle, but we have two basic programs. We have the business program, and then we have the associate in business administration. Now, what's the difference between business and business administration? One is get a job short term, which is a fine, goal to have. Then there is business administration, which is go on to a 4-year degree. So one of the business administration is designed to transfer, whereas the business degree does transfer some places, but a smaller number of universities will take that. So when we take a look at that, again, both programs are great, but one is for individuals who want to enter the workforce right upon graduation. The other one is for individuals who want to continue on. And again, what's the difference? The short-term productivity versus the long-term productivity, if we look at it in the grand scheme of things. Okay, let me jump back into our slides. There we go. All right. So if we talk about savings, again, if we increase our savings, that means automatically, because there's really 4 things, but what are the 2 things you can do with your money? You can spend it or you can save it. So what happens is if we increase our savings, it automatically means that we're going to decrease our spending. If all Americans, all households decrease their spending, then we don't need as many factors of production, land, labor, and capital to make the same amount of goods and services. But capital stock increases, it raises productivity, and we seem to see a more rapid growth. So if we save less and we spend more, then these are the byproducts that are going to happen from that. Okay, I think the next portion of this, I have a video that talks a little bit more about this. Mine is complete, and I actually have 2 shorter videos to show you. Thanks for your time and attention, and I'll see you back in Objective 5.
One of the most important pieces in the labor productivity puzzle is investment. After the crisis, investment collapsed and capital services growth, the value derived from it, is still near historic lows. When we asked company executives what are the drivers for and the barriers to investment, three stand out. First, it's demand and demand growth expectations. Secondly, it's risks and various forms of uncertainty. And thirdly, internal funding capacity and cash flow. Notably absent from the list are interest rates and access to external finance. Any policy to drive productivity growth hence needs to take into account investment, support demand, and remove unnecessary uncertainty.
In this video, we're going to be focusing on the concept of economic growth in macroeconomics. We'll define economic growth, we'll talk about the sources of economic growth, and distinguish between recovery in the ADAS model and economic growth in the ADAS model, as well as the distinction between short-run economic growth and long-run economic growth. Let's start with the definition of economic growth. This is a term that certainly you have heard of, but you may not know technically how to define it. Economic growth can be defined as an increase in the actual and the potential output of a nation over time. Recall from earlier lessons that output is measured using the figure of gross domestic product, or GDP. Therefore, we can actually measure economic growth. The measurement of economic growth is the change in a country's GDP over time. So I can put two different levels of GDP into a simple equation here. Let's call it GDP2, and we can subtract the GDP of an earlier time period, we'll call that GDP1, and multiply the result by 100 to get the what we call growth rate. A country's GDP growth rate is the percentage by which its GDP increases between two periods of time. So we know economic growth is defined as an increase in a country's GDP over time, both its actual and its potential GDP. Let's talk about the sources of economic growth. Economic growth can be the result of several factors. Anything that leads to an increase in the quantity of factors of production in a country. Now recall that factors of production refers to land, labor, and capital. So anything that increases the quantity of land, labor, and capital in a country will increase that country's actual and potential output over time and lead to economic growth. So let's break it down a little bit. What are some factors that can cause an increase in the land, labor, or capital in a country? What are some things that can actually cause economic growth? Well, a big one is technology. New technologies make land more productive. For example, agricultural technologies like farming equipment and pesticides and industrial fertilizers. These increase the quantity and the quality of fertile land in a country, making land resources more productive and increasing a country's potential and actual output. Labor is another factor of production that can be increased through population growth, or immigration. Of course, immigration is a factor that leads to population growth. Immigrants increase the actual and potential output of a country. They actually increase the size of the labor force, therefore increasing the country's potential level of output. And capital is the technology used in the production of goods and services. Capital makes workers more productive, therefore increasing the potential output of workers. What can lead to an increase in capital? This is what we call investment. We've already learned what investment is. It is spending on new equipment or technology or machinery or manufacturing tools by firms. So these are just some of the factors that can lead to economic growth in a country. New technologies, increased population through immigration or higher birth rates, investment in new technologies. All of these things, one thing these things all lead to is an increase in productivity, meaning the amount of output possible per unit of input. More technology, more investment, better capital make workers more productive, increase in a country's actual and potential output of goods and services over time. These are the main sources of economic growth. Now, in a minute, we're going to be looking at our graph and talk about how to illustrate economic growth in the graph. As we do that, let's make a distinction here between two concepts that are commonly confused with one another among economics students. And that's the distinction between recovery and growth. Recovery, we know what this term is. We learned it when we studied the business cycle graph. Recovery is what a country experiences as its output increases following a recession. So recovery is when GDP increases following a recession. Let's do a quick illustration on our graph here. Assume that the United States experiences a demand-deficient recession. Aggregate demand falls, causing output to decrease. We'll call this AD1 to a level below full employment. We'll call that Y1. Our full employment level of output is where long-run aggregate supply is vertical. We'll call that YFE. The decrease in aggregate demand causes a recessionary gap. This is all stuff we've studied in previous videos. That's the difference between Y1 and YFE. That's our recessionary gap. Now, if this country, if the United States experiences an increase in aggregate demand following this recession, is it experiencing economic growth or is it experiencing a recovery? Let's have a look. Let's say that aggregate demand increases once again, not all the way back to where it was before, but to a level closer to full employment. This country now sees its GDP increase to Y2, accompanied by demand pull inflation as price level increases. I forgot to label my price level here. We'll call that PL1. Now price level increases to PL2. We have some inflation and we have an increase in output to Y2. Is this economic growth? Well, looking back at our definition of economic growth, we have to see both an increase in actual output and potential output for it to be considered economic growth. A recovery from Y1 to Y2 does cause the former. It causes an increase in the United States' actual output, but it does not increase the nation's potential output. Potential output remains determined by the long-run aggregate supply in the country, which says that the potential output is YFE, the full employment level of output. The United States has not experienced economic growth if it experiences a recovery from a recession. So that's an important distinction when talking about economic growth. Economic growth requires that both actual and potential output increase. So the recovery phase of the business cycle looks a little bit like economic growth because GDP is increasing, actual output is increasing, but it's not economic growth because the country's potential output does not change when it recovers from a recession. So let's look at one more scenario here. I'm going to clean up my graph and we'll look at a different scenario that does show a type of economic growth. Now let's move on to illustrating what economic growth does look like in the ADAS graph. Let's start with a situation in which aggregate demand increases due to, say, a decrease in taxation, which increases households' disposable incomes and causes consumption to rise. Is an increase in aggregate demand alone an example of economic growth? Let's look at the effect that that has. Output increases in the short run from YFE to Y1, and there is demand pull inflation due to greater demand for the nation's goods and services from PL1 to PL2. Does actual output increase? In fact, it does. Actual output increases in the short run to a level beyond full employment. We have an inflationary gap in this country, so it meets the first criteria for economic growth. However, this is what we call short-run economic growth. It is not the economic growth that really matters. It increases output only in the short run as the country experiences an inflationary gap. So short-run economic growth is when only AD increases. This is not going to achieve a long-run increase in actual and potential output. As we learned in our previous video, demand pull inflation in the short run will translate into higher wages and costs of production in the long run, and this economy will self-correct as rising production costs lead to a reduction in short-run aggregate supply. An increase in AD alone does not cause long-run economic growth. It creates short-run growth, but in the long run, the economy will return to full employment as rising resource costs and wages reduce the actual level of output back to the full employment level. So short-run economic growth, it looks a lot like economic growth, once again, because GDP increases to a level beyond full employment. However, this is not long-run economic growth. Long-run economic growth requires, once again, an increase in both actual and potential output. So let's clean up our graph one more time and we'll look at a scenario in which long-run economic growth is achieved and how that looks in the ADAS graph. So finally, let's talk about how long-run economic growth looks in the ADAS graph. Let's say that there is an increase in population in the United States. Immigration and higher birth rates lead to an increase in the number of people in the country. Over time, this will mean a larger labor force, more workers available. An increase in the size of the workforce makes for cheaper workers because there's more people competing for labor in the economy, increasing short-run aggregate supply. So that's one consequence of an increased labor force, lower wages and reduced cost of production. However, an increase in the size of the labor force is also going to drive up the potential level of output because there's more workers contributing to the country's economic activity. So we're going to see an increase in long-run aggregate supply as well to LRAS1. Now we're starting to see that this is more than just short-run economic growth or a recovery from a recession. An increase in the size of the labor force is also, not surprisingly, going to increase the total level of demand in the economy. There's more consumers over time as the population grows. So we're also going to see aggregate demand increase. What we end up with is an increase in all three curves. We therefore see an increase in the full employment level of output. There is greater demand across the economy, greater supply across the economy, and an increased level of potential output and actual output. So how do we illustrate long-run economic growth in the ADAS model? Well, what have we shown here? We've shown an increase in all three curves. Potential output increases, therefore LRAS shifts out. Costs of production decrease in the short run because there's a greater supply of workers. There is also increased aggregate demand because there's going to be more consumers in the economy, or higher wages because of greater productivity in the case of increased capital or technology. So as a result, we end up with a situation in which all three curves have shifted out, the actual and potential level of output increase to a new full employment equilibrium. Short-run economic growth is achieved only when AD increases, or an increase in AS as a result of a temporary decrease in resource costs such as lower energy prices. However, long-run economic growth is only achieved when there's an increase in the actual and the potential level of output as a result of an increase in the quantity of land, labor, or capital in the economy.
Here we go. One step at a time.